that was a good turnout. There are 2 seats in the front. If everyone, don't be shy. Please come and sit down. If not, we can just maybe sit on the stairs. We have about 30 people, more than we thought, but I think that's due to the fact that Nadja is awesome. So, just want to thank you. My name is Nadja. I'm the co-chair of the HEF SEPAC with Nate. I want to thank Nate and HEF for bringing this show together. Did a lot of great work, and thank you very much. Just want to again thank you all. This year has been really great for SEPAC. We've done a lot of support and turn up for different kinds of events. And I think it's just a lot of great energy and hang, and I want to thank everybody for that. Just a couple SEPAC things that are up and coming. We actually will have a table at the town meeting. So to thank the town for their support of special ed, the special ed budget. Another big event, and sort of the last big event for the year, will be on May 19th. We're having an inclusive fashion show at Hingham Country Club, where girls from the special needs community will be models, and we have sort of a cross-population of people in Hingham be modeling and showing different wear. So it's a really, really fun night, and details on that will be coming out soon. SEPAC does have monthly meetings. It's a great bunch of people. If you have any interest in getting to know more about our organization, helping out with something, if you have a great idea and you say, I'd love to see programming on sensory or college application for kids with special needs, come to a meeting and let's talk about it, because we are really open to different ideas and you kind of just make them happen. So if that's your style, come on by. Without any other fanfare, I'm going to introduce you to Nate, who put this show together with HEF. I really want to thank them. If you guys want to wave to Alan in the back, thank you very much. Here you go, here's Nate.
Okay, thanks, Diane. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, faces who have been at other SEPAC events before. For those of you who fit that profile, you know that this year has been cast our Year of Friendship. And I know Diane has kind of given a shout out to the Hingham Education Foundation, but I do want to say they've been our friends and partners through this, and they were the financial backing to help pull this off. So Alan and Heather, thank you. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guest tonight, Dr. Nadja Reilly. Nadja Reilly is a clinical psychologist with over 15 years of experience specializing in children, adolescents, and families. She completed her graduate training at the University of Miami in Florida, and her clinical internship and postdoctoral fellowship at Boston Children's Hospital. Dr. Reilly was a staff psychologist in the Department of Psychiatry at Children's Hospital for 12 years, and is currently a consulting psychologist at the department. In addition to being a lecturer of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, Dr. Reilly is the Associate Director of the Freeman Center for Children and Family Development at William James College, as well as Director of Training for the Center's Internship and Practicum Placements. She is a core faculty member of the Clinical Psychology Doctoral Program and faculty in the Children and Families Adversity and Resilience concentration. Dr. Reilly is the editor of Preventing Depression, a Toolkit for Schools, co-editor of How Not to Treat a Secret Peer Leadership Curriculum, editor and principal editor of the Break Free from Depression School Curriculum, and executive producer of Break Free from Depression, a documentary focusing on adolescent depression. Dr. Reilly is the author of the book Anxiety and Depression in the Classroom, A Teacher's Guide to Fostering Self-Regulation in Young Students. Here's what it looks like. I read it. It's a great book. Encourage everybody to go pick one up. It's also a book that the leadership team in Dr. Gallo's leadership team here at Hingham is reading. And so the administration is reading this book, and it's a focal point for them this year. Dr. Reilly has presented at numerous local and national conferences, and we are very excited to have her here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Nadja Reilly to Hingham.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, and I'm so sorry for those of you that are sitting on steps. I feel very badly, so I'll move around, and if you need me to be louder or move to a different area, just let me know. I am really, really grateful for your presence here tonight, and we have about an hour or so together, which means that we'll get to cover some topics generally, but I really don't want you to leave feeling like you didn't get the one thing that you really wanted to know about in coming here. So if you have any particular questions that I'm not covering or anything in particular that you want to raise, I encourage you to do that at any time during the time that we're together. So what I'm hoping to cover today are different things. One is to talk a little bit about anxiety and depression and how they are different from stress. As you might know, we're sort of terming everything under stress. Like kids will tell you, this is really stressful, I'm so stressed. And so one of the things that's been really helpful in getting them to be more aware of what's going on for them, but also to help develop coping skills, is to help them understand how stress is different from anxiety and depression. Also want to talk about how anxiety and depression manifest across different developmental stages, and talking about the impact of depression and anxiety on learning and relationships. And finally, I want to talk about building relationships and resilience. And as Nate was talking about focusing on the year of the friendship, I think it is so important to really focus on relationships that I want to talk a little bit more about what we can do in the home setting, but also really how to encourage relationships between parents and teachers so we can really maximize the work that we do for our kids. Okay. So I wanted to point out a couple of different things. A lot of times I'm asked, what is the difference between what we would consider distress or just a transient kind of disturbance versus what is something that's more indicative of a clinical situation? So when we're talking about distress, it's something typically that is consistent with the developmental stage that the child is in. So for example, if you have a 5, 6, 7-year-old, it's very normal for that child to be scared of the dark or to be worried about natural disasters because those are fears that are normative for that developmental stage. However, when we realize that we're moving across from what's developmentally appropriate to something that's more clinical is when those fears are out of proportion to the developmental stage, or they're interfering so much that it gets in the way of the child's other areas of development. So for example, I would be a little bit more concerned if the fears related to having somebody break into the house prevented the child from ever leaving, or from going to sleepovers because they're worried that something bad will happen to the parents. This is when you start to see that those fears are actually interfering with relationships or with things that they're supposed to be doing as part of their growth. Distress is temporary. Maybe they're having a hard time because they had a bad grade and they're not feeling so great. So maybe for a couple of days things won't be so good. But you see that bounce back period, that's pretty quick. And that concept of how quickly somebody bounces back is really important. And I think one of the pieces that we use diagnostically. So if it takes a child a long time to recover from an event that has happened, and he or she continues to perseverate on it, to think about it, then that is something that I would want to look at. Versus if somebody's having a bad day, next day they wake up, they're pretty good, they're good to go again. It's, excuse me, context or situation specific. So for those of you with teenagers who might be having first relationships and they go through a breakup, and they feel pretty sad related to the breakup, that's normal and that makes a lot of sense. And the sadness and the anxiety is usually focused on that relationship. But when I start hearing something like, you know, nobody's really ever going to love me, or I'm not worthy of people caring about me, that's what I call that kind of bleeding over effect, where it's now the person is feeling that way about other relationships, about his or her worthiness in relationships. That's very different than being sad over a breakup. So as I've been mentioning, clinical concerns are when it's out of context, pervasive, global, and interferes with areas of functioning. Now, Every single one of your children here is different, right? So there aren't any exact formulas, but I like to give you kind of a frame of reference of how long a long bounce back period is, or for how long, that you've been seeing things that are concerning you, is a long enough period to where you start thinking, you know what, I better get this checked out a little bit more. And for me, that period is usually between 2 and 4 weeks. Okay, so we're going to discuss some symptoms of anxiety and depression. And if you start seeing some of those things that are happening pretty frequently, more days than not, interfering with functioning between 2 and 4 weeks, it's a good thing to just be more on the cautious side and investigate more into it. Okay. A lot of times the question comes up of why are the kids struggling with anxiety or depression? Why do these things come up, right? So what we have is a model to understand that. 50 years ago, actually, I should mention, we've come a long way, because about 50 years ago, people didn't even think that depression could happen in kids. And in fact, we know that anxiety and depression can and do occur in kids. But at that time, the other thought was that it had to be a singular event, something that was either catastrophic or something that was so significant that would cause the disturbance in kids. What we now know is that it's not really one singular event, but it's usually a combination of different risk factors that come together and kind of tip that vulnerability scale so that kids develop either an anxiety or mood disorder, or sometimes both. So the piece, I don't think my pointer is working. So the biological piece is a pretty significant one when we talk about anxiety and depression. With anxiety, it's usually about in the mid-50s to mid-60s% of heritability in terms of genetics. It's also just about that high for depression, for unipolar depression. When we're talking about bipolar depression, it actually increases a child's likelihood of developing that by 5 times if one or both parents have bipolar disorder. So there's a piece that has to do pretty strongly with genetics. However, it is not definite that if one or both parents struggle with depression, that the child also will. There are other factors that can play a role to mitigate that. From a psychological perspective, we know that kids that tend to struggle with more pessimistic viewpoints, or kids that don't feel like they have good coping skills to manage what's going on for them, or kids who really struggle with their sense of self-esteem are a lot more vulnerable. And from a social perspective, we know that there are some things that can play a role. For example, from a family perspective, loss of a parent is one of the biggest risk factors associated with depression. But it doesn't only have to be through death. It can be through significant losses or separation that can also present a risk factor. Difficulties in schools or with peers. We know a lot of kids who struggle with bullying are also quite vulnerable to depression. And what happens is that it's really the interaction of those 3 spheres coming together that determine how the child's depression or anxiety will develop. We don't really have a formula, so I can't really tell you if you have 2 in this area, 1 in that area, and 3 in that area. It's more unique to the individual child. But what we know is that from a prevention perspective, we want to build up as many resilience or protective factors as we can to counteract these risk factors. And a little bit later on, we'll talk about how to build those protective factors. Does that make sense? Any questions about this? Okay. All right. So I wanted to present to you some brief statistics about anxiety and depression. However, again, if anybody has questions about other disorders, please feel free to ask. We're focusing on these internalizing disorders today, but quite often, especially in adolescence, anxiety and depression tend to co-occur with other disorders. So it's not uncommon, for example, that there might also be an eating disorder, substance abuse disorder. Anxiety is actually one of the most occurring disorders in childhood, and typically it begins around age 11, but we can see some of the symptoms begin as early as in preschool. If it's not treated and if it's not addressed from early on, the difficulty with anxiety is that most of the time kids will then develop symptoms of a secondary anxiety disorder. A very common anxiety disorder in kids is generalized anxiety disorder, and that is when there's this kind of pervasive fear of something going wrong. That is, in fact, the nature of anxiety, is this unease, this worry that something will go wrong. Kids that struggle with generalized anxiety disorder really worry about many different things. So, for example, you might get questions like, well, are you going to pick me up after school? And what happens if you run out of gas? And well, so how are you going to call me? And then who's going to pick me up? And then who's going to be home? And there are a lot of questions that have to do about general safety or well-being. So you can imagine that's a pretty distressing way to be, because you're feeling like something negative is about to happen all the time. Another pretty common one is social anxiety disorder. And that's when there's a pretty significant fear of what other people are thinking about you. So imagine me sitting up here with all of these eyes on me, and if I'm struggling with social anxiety disorder, I would feel almost paralyzed, because one of my biggest concerns would be, what if I do something wrong? What if I fall? What if I trip? What if I say something stupid? What if somebody laughs at me? Now, I say this to you because it's important to think about how the symptoms of anxiety play a role in school. If you're constantly managing these thoughts and these worries, it's very difficult to be able to pay attention and to be able to follow consecutively what's happening in the school and in classroom in new learning situations. So a lot of times when kids struggle with pretty significant anxiety, they might also be having school difficulties. And it's not for lack of intelligence, and it's not for lack of wanting to do well. It's that often these negative thoughts and recurring thoughts get in the way. Okay. These are some of the symptoms of anxiety. I do have to tell you, a lot of the symptoms for both anxiety and depression manifest in the body. And you know how some people might say, oh, that's just in your head. Actually, they're very real. The experience of these physical symptoms do occur, and kids that have, especially depression, have a much lower threshold for pain and a much higher sensitivity for any body sensation. So all of those stomach aches that they tell you about that they're having, the tummy aches in the morning before going to school, or maybe the headaches that are happening, or feeling exhausted, or feeling like they have no energy, all of those things are actually very real physical manifestations of the mood that they're experiencing. So these are some of the other symptoms associated with anxiety. In the classroom or maybe at home, sometimes it can manifest like a bit of argumentativeness, right? But why? Why did you do that? But you told me it was going to be this way, but why is it happening? I can tell you this with a fair degree of certainty, one from being a clinician, but also from being a parent with a child who really struggles with anxiety too. So the very real experiences that they have in terms of worries, in terms of anticipation of something going wrong, and of the way that it might interfere in the classroom and at home. Okay. Now this is kind of the quick and dirty version of anxiety and depression, just because we could spend 2 hours on each of those topics. I'm going to turn over to depression, but before I do that, are there other questions about anxiety before I move on? Yes, ma'am.
Question, is it possible or common to have a child that has anxiety but is kind of internalizing it, and so they're not coming at you with a lot of questions?
Yes.
And stuff, but then they can fall apart easily?
Yes, absolutely. So it really depends a lot on the child's temperament, personality, how some of these symptoms might manifest. There are some symptoms that are pretty central across the board to the experience, but the actual manifestation might be different. And you might have some kids that are more quiet, that are internalize things more, that maybe they worry about telling you about what's going on because they don't want to upset you, or they're worried about what you might think, and so they tend to keep it in. But the falling apart comes when that becomes so much that it becomes really difficult to just hold on to. And so you might see crying, you might see isolating, you might see falling apart when they can't complete something. Okay. Yes?
How have you seen changes in all of this relating specifically to technology?
So that is a great question. Related to technology, one of the biggest impacts that I have seen is that the immediate feedback and lack of time in between to just, kind of put yourself back together and think about what you want to do, and that almost urgency to respond really play up the symptoms of anxiety. And so I think it takes a lot more intentionality around having breaks in between, having lack of access to some technology, especially social media, because it doesn't give kids enough time to process what's going on. And if you're already looking for something that's either threatening or going wrong, can you imagine? It's so hard to read tone from texts and what's written that it almost reinforces the negative thinking. Okay. So regarding depression, we can think about the difference between stress and depression in this way. Typical changes in mood look like that green wiggly line at the top, right? It goes up and down depending on where you are, maybe that 3 o'clock time when we all need a bit of caffeine to kind of get us going, and then we're up again. And those changes in mood are absolutely normal. If you have a quick bounce back time, if you can recognize that you're not feeling so great, but then you do something to make yourself feel better, all that is normal. For kids, adolescents, adults that are struggling with depression, that dip in the mood is much lower, and the symptoms are much more severe and they last longer. The really important part here in telling kids about this is that especially adolescents feel like this kind of thing is supposed to happen, because they're moody adolescents, or that's what they've been told. Or sometimes they feel like, I don't really know if this is normal or not. So a lot of the work that we as parents have to do is help them to recognize what some of the normative ups and downs are, versus when you start noticing that things are not going well for a consistent amount of time. And so that's the point, to introduce questions like, what? I noticed that over the past couple of days you've just been acting differently, or I've noticed that you haven't been going out with your friends as much. Do you want to talk about that, right? You might offer that invitation many, many times before it's actually accepted, but the important part is to be able to actually verbalize the changes that you're noticing and invite conversations about that. Okay. So, as I was mentioning, a family history of depression and exposure to stressful life events are among the most robust risk factors for depression. The average age of onset for major clinical depression is between 11 and 14. We do see some kids in elementary school who develop depression, and the rates of boys to girls is about the same, but that's a much lower incidence. When we really start to see the development and the spike in symptomatology is around middle school. Usually 7th and 8th grades tend to be the tough ones. And at that time, usually around the time of puberty, we see the rates changing from twice as many girls developing depression than boys. Now, I actually have a theory about that. I think that what we're doing is actually just recognizing it more in girls, or maybe more girls are coming forward. So we really have to be careful with our boys too, in terms of the possible risk for depression in them. Now, one of the things that we know is that depression is absolutely something that can impact the academic and social functioning of kids. But it doesn't mean that it's going to do that permanently. The important thing about talks like this and about conversations that you have with your kids and with your teachers is that the research tells us that if we identify it early and we treat it aggressively in the beginning, kids actually do much better. If we don't treat it, and if we let several episodes of depression go by untreated, that's when it becomes more likely that it becomes more of a chronic issue. So one of the things that I really advocate for is, well, a few things actually. One is if you are concerned about anything, right? You see some of the symptoms of depression, you're thinking, I don't know, something's different, and you trust your parent gut in that something is different. It never hurts to just have an evaluation. It never hurts to have information about how your child is doing. You can have a baseline, or you can actually identify if something's going wrong. The other thing I would encourage you to do is, if you have a child who is in treatment and they have gone through the acute part of treatment and they start to look better and they're feeling better, don't stop treatment there. Because what we know is that the kids that stop treatment prematurely are more susceptible to falling back into it. So what you want to do is go into what we call maintenance treatment, which is you go through the acute phase, kids are doing better, and then you go back in, kind of like for a 3,000-mile checkup, right? You go back in, you see how the kids are doing, you help them develop skills that change with their developmental needs. You anticipate any transitions or changes that might be coming up, and those are really important times to get kind of follow-up treatment. It doesn't have to be lengthy, 1 or 2 visits are fine. But what we know is that kids that do that kind of maintenance treatment actually do 50 to 60% better long-term than kids that don't have that maintenance treatment. So it's really a worthwhile practice. Okay, these are some of the symptoms associated with depression. So for us as adults, we tend to have more of that depressed mood, that sad mood that you typically associate with depression. For children and for adolescents, you see more irritability. So rather than seeing the tears or the sadness initially, you might actually see them being really like snapping at you or having more fights with siblings, with you, kind of saying, leave me alone, isolating. You might see that anger and irritability first. There's a pretty significant change in terms of interest related to different activities. Now, some kids are really good at kind of masking what's going on, and they might continue to participate in activities, they might continue to physically be there, but when you talk to them, what they say is that they feel like, I'm here, but I'm not really getting any pleasure out of it. So a really important question to ask your kids is not just, did you go or did you not go, but how was it when you were there? What are you liking about it? What still feels like, what motivates you to go to the practice or to keep doing this sport? Getting at that deeper sort of interest level is much more diagnostic than anything else. There might be significant weight gain or loss, although I will have to tell you, loss is probably a little bit more predictive than gain, because if you have kids that are around puberty, weight gain is actually something that is likely to happen anyway. So to me, a significant weight loss is a little bit more of an indication of possible depression. Insomnia or hypersomnia, this is really significant if you're having kids that tell you, I can't get out of bed, I'm having a really hard time, or are really missing a lot of early morning classes. Typically what happens is that the brain is going and going and going and going, and they can't shut it off. So I once worked with a young man who told me that he felt like he had a tape recorder in his head and he couldn't press the stop button, and it would just keep going, and it would be these negative thoughts that kept bothering him. What happens is if you have that going on all the time, it's really hard to shut your brain down enough to be able to fall asleep. And when you do fall asleep, there might be some frequent awakenings, And then that means that in the morning you're exhausted, right? Think about yourselves when you're really stressed and you have a lot in your mind and you still wake up feeling completely exhausted. This is that same sensation that's going on for the kids. Fatigue or loss of energy can definitely happen. I've had a lot of kids who say, you know, I feel like I have the flu. I'm just really, really exhausted. I feel like I have no energy. I'm so tired. Or teachers will say that, you know, the kids have their heads down on the desks. However, I should also mention there's a subgroup of kids that have what we call an agitated depression. And an agitated depression presents as much more just that, agitated, right? A hard time settling, a hard time getting into any activity, and almost feeling a bit impulsive, right? Kids that have an agitated depression might get into more frequent arguments or perhaps even physical fights because that sense of disturbance inside is coming out externally. There's a diminished ability to think or concentrate. And actually, for some kids, the diagnostic process or the recognition process, I should say, begins by thinking that maybe there's a learning disability here that we didn't pick up because the cognitive symptoms of depression mimic a learning disability so much. So things like they have a really hard time remembering things, they have a really hard time concentrating, they have a really hard time processing new information. So for example, kids that struggle with depression hate and have such a hard time with like essay exams, because they have to remember everything. They have to put everything together, synthesize it. And so one of the accommodations actually that we have for kids who struggle with depression is to have multiple choice tests instead of essay exams, especially during their most acute periods. And finally, at the most severe, some kids might have thoughts of death. And this can be either passive thoughts, like I wonder what would happen if I wasn't around, or it could be more active thoughts that involve a plan to take his or her life. Developmentally, there's a bit of a difference in terms of the primary symptoms that we see. In preschool, again, very rare, but we do know that it can happen, and you would definitely be able to tell a child who's struggling with depression at that age. They would be very, very listless, very little energy, not a lot of growth in terms of milestones and development, especially in the social area. School age, there's a pretty high occurrence with more of the disruptive behavior. So sometimes you might see kids that might be either diagnosed with ADHD or ODD because we're thinking the acting out has to do with more of an externalizing piece, but it has to do more with mood. Younger adolescents tend to have a really big spike in their symptoms of anxiety. In older adolescents, you really start hearing more of the hopelessness and helplessness related to how they're feeling. Now that's a very broad stroke, and again, for some kids, the primary symptoms might be more anxiety. For some kids, it might be more acting out, but this is kind of generally what the trajectory looks like. Are there particular questions about this? All right, so there are some things that kind of cut across the two disorders in terms of what's going on for the kids. One of them has to do with high levels of shame. There's usually a sense of embarrassment about what's going on for them. And there's also a pretty big sense of shame about what they're contributing to a situation. So for example, if they're at your house and they're helping with groceries and they drop a jar of spaghetti sauce, you know, a child that's not really experiencing depression might say, oh gosh, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean to do that, that was an accident. But he would know that it was an accident that could happen to anybody. It didn't happen because it was him. A child who's struggling with depression might say, I'm really sorry, I just screw everything up. That happened because of me. Right? It's because of me that these bad things are happening. They have difficulties with emotional regulation. So they tend to experience negative emotions more intensely than positive ones. That's why it can be really hard when you try to have interventions like, oh, come on, you know what, let's go out, let's go to a movie, or let's go do something together. It might be harder to engage the child because they're feeling a lot more stuck in the negative emotion rather than the positive one. There's a sense of helplessness associated with that, and it can have a pretty big impact on relationships. It can have an impact on the relationship with parents. Sometimes when adolescents are really struggling with depression, it can have a big impact in terms of just being able to understand one another or being able to understand what you could do. And it also has an impact on peer relationships. Okay. Now, the one thing is, I will tell you, avoidance is a major characteristic associated with anxiety in particular, but also with depression. So there might be a lot of avoidance around new situations or avoidance around beginning treatment, avoidance about, incorporating suggestions that you might make. That's because there's a fear of the unknown. There's a fear that they will somehow mess up. So one of the most important things to do as parents is to not give in to that avoidance. So I'll give you an example. My son in the morning, for the longest time, didn't want to go to school. I don't feel so good, my tummy really hurts, I have to go to the bathroom. Okay, you have to go to the bathroom. Let's go to the bathroom, let's go to school. Well, I really don't feel well, can I just stay home today? Just today. And if I stay home today, I promise you I'll go to school tomorrow. Like, I won't give you a hard time. Now, if he's not feeling well and I'm thinking, okay, maybe I'll give him a break, right? How many of you have been there? All right, I'll give him a break. And they make a really good argument, right? They bring that logic to you and you're like, yeah, that makes sense. All right, I'll keep you home today. But what happens is that by doing that, you're kind of giving into the avoidance. So you're reinforcing that, outside of here is not safe. I'm going to keep you here. You're going to feel better only here. And they're not going to have the opportunity to sit with that distress of like, ugh, I really don't want to go to school. I'm not feeling so great. What am I going to do to manage those feelings? And once I get to school, how do I function in school? They need to have that exposure. And then you're so mean. I can't believe you're making me go to school. Yep, I hate you. I know, I'm sorry. But you have to then really encourage them to get there, because otherwise this is how you get into a pattern of school refusal really easily. Okay, so responding to the need. There are some really core areas that we look at when we're talking about responding to the need. Certainly for kids who are struggling with anxiety and depression, but I have to mention these are also areas that we want to focus on for kids that are not experiencing any emotional distress, because these are areas where we want to build coping skills. This is where we can build those protective factors that will counteract those risk factors that we saw earlier on. So thoughts, behaviors, relationships, and feelings. All of these things are guided by self-regulation, which we'll talk about. And one very important point I want to make is that self-regulation is distinct from intelligence. Okay? It doesn't have to do anything with IQ. A lot of times people focus on, the level of intelligence of the child or the level of ability. When we're talking about things like emotional health and wellness, it's separate from IQ and level of ability. And what we do is we really work with the strengths that the child is already bringing. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about the power of relationships. When we are lonely, our brains are lonely. We are social creatures. We really need others, right? Usually when you get stressed out, what's the first thing you think about?
Food.
Chocolate. Maybe having that food with other people, right? Maybe. it usually involves reaching out. Who can I tell how miserable I'm feeling? Oh, or who can help me feel better, right? Who might have some good food for me? So what happens is if we're feeling lonely, our brains are feeling lonely, especially the front part of our brains called the executive functions. And these executive functions are the ones that are responsible for helping us to make good decisions, to problem solve, and to regulate. So if you're by yourself, if you're feeling lonely, emotionally, you're not going to be able to develop as strong strategies as if you have the context of a strong, supportive relationship with you. It's just the case for all of us, for kids and for us as well. Forming friendships is really critical to emotional wellness, and that's why a lot of the prevention kind of work that we do focuses on how to get kids to have cooperative opportunities. Focus on cooperative, no competition. Really the purpose is to build friendships that will help kids have the opportunity to practice some of these skills, but also model and learn from other kids. And among children struggling with depression, parental support is associated with reduced depressive symptoms. Peer support is associated with higher academic self-efficacy, and connection to teacher support is associated with all three outcomes. So, when we talk about that saying, it takes a village, it's true. We really need to think about what are the supports that we can put in place for the kids. As parents, I'm sure that you take on a lot of that responsibility, right? Thinking, okay, I need to be a really good sounding board. I need to be somebody that really listens. And of course, you can be, but also think about who else can help you in this. I have two boys, 11 and 14. My 14-year-old loves talking to my dad. They just connect on a level that I'll never know. And they connect, and he tells them things, and then my dad's like, hey, did you hear Christopher did that? I was like, oh, what? No, he didn't tell me. And then I was feeling like, oh, why didn't he tell me? But the reality is that now, once I took my ego out of it, I was really, really happy to know that that relationship was in place, because that serves as another avenue that he has to talk to somebody. Maybe he doesn't feel he can talk to me about something, he can talk to my dad. So I encourage you to think about who are the other people in your life that can help you, that can serve as additional sources of support. I would really encourage you, if you have a child who's struggling in any way, or even if you have a child who's not and who's doing beautifully, to have really good communication with teachers, because they see your kids for many, many hours of a day. And any strategies that they're putting forth in the classroom, you can also use in the home setting and vice versa. So, you know, when I communicated with my teachers, with my son's teachers, my little one, I would say, you know what, if he has to go to the bathroom, if he asks you to go, please let him go. That's the way that his anxiety goes down. Now, they would not have known that, and they would have said, no, you can't have a bathroom pass, right? Because they get annoyed when kids ask for a lot of bathroom passes. But that communication was really helpful. So I encourage you to think about how can you start building that network. Okay. So what can you say, right, when kids come to you with these situations, either in distress or just when they come to you every day to kind of talk about what's going on? Give them a sense of safety, right? How we respond to how they're feeling is really, really, really important. And by a sense of safety, I mean create a space where they feel like it's safe for them to tell you what's going on, and you won't jump to give them a solution, and you won't jump to say, oh, don't worry about that, it's fine. Because of course, that's what we want to say. We want to make them okay. As an example, when my older son was in 6th grade, they had their first boy-girl dance, and he was telling me when he got home that a girl had said she didn't want to dance with him because he was fat and ugly. Now, all right, my reaction was like, all right, I'm going down to find that girl, right? Who tells my son that? Nobody. And he's not fat and ugly. So she was clearly wrong. But it was so painful. It was so painful because clearly he was really hurt. And so instead of me saying, oh, well, she's stupid, don't worry about that, she doesn't know what she's talking about, I had to sit with that sadness with him. And trust me, it was so hard. After I left him, I went to my room and I cried. But it was really sitting with that really hard emotion and not saying, it's fine, don't worry about it. Because you know what? He is experiencing, he has to experience it. But safety comes from you being able to sit with someone and they can hold really hard stuff with you. And they can be there for you and they can witness it without necessarily rushing in to solve it for them. And that's really important because they need to find their own voices and they need to find their own ways in dealing with failure and disappointments. But if you're there to hold that space, it can be incredibly therapeutic. Self-regulation for parent and child. How many of you have wanted to scream as loud as you possibly can in frustration? Right? Admit it. You all have, right? Right. So that's a great moment to say, you know what? I'm at a point right now where I just can't have this conversation. I'm going to step out, I'm going to take some deep breaths, and I'm going to come right back and we can talk. When you model your own self-regulation, it can be really helpful. And they'll listen to what you're saying, too. I've worked with kindergartners, and I say, so, what do you guys do when you're stressed? What do you think I heard? I heard, oh, have a glass of wine. My mom says you have a glass of wine when you're stressed out. Right? They listen, they pay attention to these things. And when they see you be very real and say like, wow, I had a really bad day. I was not expecting half of the things that happened to me, and I'm really feeling overwhelmed, and I'm going to try to figure out what to do. That's okay for you to say that. That's really important modeling. Feelings are okay to have and to experience. You know, the worst thing you could say to someone who's really worrying is, just don't worry about it. Just don't think about it. Okay, good luck with that one. So it's okay. So tell me what you're worrying about. Okay, so let's talk about it. Practicing ways to tolerate distress. So one of the best and quickest ways to tolerate distress is to teach kids how to do it in little increments, right? You're not going to expect them to tolerate distress in 30-minute increments, but you can certainly help them to see that if they wait just 1 minute, things will get better, right? So I often tell them the 3-3-3 rule. Okay, before you flip out, before you send out that text back to your friend saying how much you hate her, can you wait 3 seconds? Can you just wait 3 seconds? Can you wait 3 minutes? Is that possible? Could you wait 3 hours? And if we're feeling really lucky, can you wait 3 days? The point of that is that from 1 minute to the next, they'll be able to calm down and they'll see things differently, but they'll need you as kind of their external coach, their external voice to be able to do that. The other thing that you can do is help them breathe, okay? So what I want you guys to do is if you feel comfortable, I want you to put a hand on your chest and a hand on your stomach. And just breathe normally. Take a nice deep breath in and out. What do you notice? What hand for you moves the most? The one on the chest or the one on your stomach? Chest, stomach? It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter. For a couple of seconds, you were just focusing on your breathing and you were paying attention to your hands, right? Tricked you. So that's another thing that you can do. Just for a couple of seconds, take a deep breath so you can kind of come back into your body. We know that breathing is actually one of the things that truly can change the way that you're feeling at that moment. Okay, building resilience. I know that you've probably heard about a lot of workshops like the 10 top tips you have to follow to build resilience, or the 10 things that resilient teams do. The truth is that it's not as easy as a quick checklist. It really takes a lot of time. But one of the things that can be really helpful is thinking about how you can build conversations and relationships with your kids that will promote, one, self-awareness for them, but two, internal motivation for themselves. Okay, that's a really important piece. So you celebrate the child, you don't celebrate the outcome. We've gotten into a lot of, great job, you got an A, that's awesome. Look at your report card, it's straight A's, that's wonderful. But in that, we don't celebrate the process that the child has gone through, and it's that process that builds that internal motivation. So, you know what? I noticed that this term, you were doing your homework right when you got home from school, and I noticed that you were working really hard. And you know what? It's not straight A's, but I know that you did the best that you could. Way to go, right? That's celebrating the process. When you do that, it's almost like an internal challenge for the child then to do better, right? Long-term versus short-term goals. I have worked with some really stressed out 7th graders that are freaking out because they know for sure they have to go to Harvard Law School. Really, you have to go to, yes, I have to go to Harvard Law School. And they're very, very committed to that. They're very invested in it. Now, it's fine if you want to have that as a goal, but it's important at this stage for kids to have short-term attainable goals. If the only goals that they're setting are ones that are happening in 7 years, they're going to find a lot of getting tripped up along the way, and that's going to feel only discouraging. That long-term goal is going to feel so far away. So you want to think about, okay, you want to get to Harvard Law School? Great, that's a long-term goal. We're going to put it over here in a little box, and we're going to save it until later. But for right now, let's build a goal about what you want to get to your first term in math class. How about we start there? The other piece is that in telling kids about short-term goals, to incorporate failure as one of those goals. I really want you to fail at something, because then you'll figure out what works and what doesn't. So then if this doesn't work, then you go to plan B. Inherent in all that is that you want there to be more flexibility in kids' thinking. When kids get really stuck in one particular path, way of doing things is when perfectionism tends to come up. It's when they really get stuck on one viewpoint and they view any variation of that as a failure, when in fact, taking this little side road, that's actually really good. I learned something about myself this way. I'm going to take this little side road. Hey, that's really great because I figured out that actually this is my path. It fits me much better than here. The other pieces that have shown to be really helpful are having agency and power. So let them figure out solutions for themselves. So as an example, my son was like, oh my gosh, I forgot my homework. My math teacher is going to kill me. I said, ooh, well, I hope I see you in the afternoon. Well, you got to write her a note. I'm not writing her a note. Mom, you're so mean. Yes, I know, but I'm not writing a note. You have to go up to her and you have to say, Mrs. Reilly, I'm really sorry, I forgot my homework. A lot of this independent problem solving has to happen so that they can develop agency. This is what counteracts helplessness and hopelessness later on. Experiences of social justice. So any kind of experiences that you could get kids to volunteer, to really be able to be committed to something they believe in. All of that has been shown long-term to have protective powers against anxiety and depression. Cultural rootedness and spirituality. Also two very important things that you can really work on at the home. The spirituality does not have to be driven by a particular religion per se, but it's more a sense of connection to something that's meaningful. It can be to a higher power, it can be to a cause, it can be to internal beliefs, but that sense of meaning and purpose for kids that are high on that, again, really highly protective powers against depression and anxiety later. Why? Because it develops a sense of hope, right? And hope is different from optimism. Optimism is thinking that everything's going to be good and things are going to turn out well, and that's important. But hope is thinking that even if things go poorly, you can still get to where you want to go because you'll find a different way. And that's the process. Okay, so really quickly, I just want to mention, if you're worried about your child, if anything that you have heard tonight maybe resonates in some ways, I encourage you again to find help early. At William James College, where I work, there's a resource and referral service. It's free of charge, and we contract with the town of Hingham, actually. So if you call in that referral service, we can help you find a therapeutic match within 2 weeks or less. And we do that by matching by your insurance, by the type of service that you're looking for, by the distance that you're seeking to travel. So if you're looking for help in finding a provider, which can be hard, I encourage you to visit our website. It's WilliamJamesInterface, all one word, .com. You know, let your child know that you're worried. Let your child know that there's something that you've noticed that's different, and you wanna find out, you wanna learn more. I would encourage you to call your insurance company to find out what kind of services you have available. Call your child's teachers or other adults. It's really helpful, especially with kids, to get information from different viewpoints. So if you're ready to get an evaluation or to find a provider, it can be really helpful to go in prepared with information that you've gathered from other caretakers or from teachers. And then set up an appointment with a therapist that works with kids. It's really important to know that the treatments for anxiety and depression are not the same in adults. It's not like a, kid version. They're different approaches. So it's really important for you to work with someone who's been trained in working with kids. And finally, these are some of the some resource helpline and information. And here's the phone number for Interface Resource Service. But I'd like to open it up to questions. Yes?
What do you do about a child who, when we talk to the teachers are like, oh, he's great. He's talking to everybody. He's, engaged. We have no worries. And he's absolutely falling apart the moment he hits the door.
Yeah. So it's not unusual. The question is, what happens if you have a child who's doing well at school, but then at home falls apart? It's not unusual for that to happen, actually, because kids will really bring in every ounce of energy that they have to school to try to do well, but then they're so exhausted when they get home, they just crash. So for kids that are really trying to maintain that appearance and to be able to do well in school, it's not unusual that the second they get home, they crash, they're exhausted from having that. So I wouldn't rule out anything going on just because he or she is doing well in school. I think it's good if they're doing well in school because that means there's still a level of connection, but it's still important to address what might be going on at home. Or really how he or she is allowing that piece to be seen at home, I should say. Other questions, comments?
Are there good therapists and the interface that you have? The therapists that you suggest or somehow connect us with, are they specifically trained in child anxiety or just child therapy?
So we have a huge database of providers that are around the area. And with each provider, we fill out a profile that allows us to know what his or her areas of specialty are. So usually people that are trained child clinicians will know how to address anxiety and depression in other areas. They might have that as a particular specialty, but usually the training encompasses all of that. And they are identified by their areas of expertise. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry. Was there a follow-up?
I do have one.
Yes.
Any suggestions or books that you've read or ideas that you have on helping kids make friends?
Helping kids make friends. So I would have to do a little bit of research to see what recent books there are. APA, the American Psychological Association, if you go on apa.org, they have a list of child books. so that you can read with them or you can use them, in different ways. A lot of them focus on helping them make friends, and it's called Imagination Press. So like imagination, but without the I. And they have a series of books that focus on making friends, what to do about worries, a whole host of topics. You're welcome. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me get to you and then I'll get to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have advice for overcoming anxiety and resistance to therapy itself?
Yes.
I mean, even once it's in process of having anxiety and resistance ramp up in therapy setting?
So usually when you have a ramp up in anxiety and resistance is when you're getting to the tough part of therapy, right? When you're getting to the core of what's really bothering you. And that is when the avoidance kicks in. I don't want to talk about that. That's really hard. It feels yucky. And that's when kids will say, please don't make me go. He doesn't know what he's talking about. We don't do anything. We just play games and it doesn't work. And that's usually when I'll say, you know what, can we commit to 3 more sessions? Can we just, get through the hard part? Because I know sometimes it can be hard, but it's helpful if you continue rather than just stopping abruptly. But usually that anxiety and resistance happens when there's something meaty that's being talked about. Yes?
On that same topic,
I'm sorry.
how do you know the difference between that this counselor's not working for them versus that they're actually coming to you?
So I would definitely, when you start working with a counselor, I would insist that you have an individual session when you get to know the counselor and what his or her philosophy is around engaging parents in the process. And then I would, you can do an interview kind of a thing. And I would also encourage your child to participate in that. So what's important to you in the person you want to work with? The more agency they have around that, the better. The other thing I would say is, have a sense of what the goals are and what kinds of skills are being taught. Because there should always be a treatment plan along with goals and expected ideas about how long things should take. Now granted, it might not work out that way because something comes up, but if you have a sense of that, then you have more understanding of what's happening. And I would also then be, if your child's coming to you saying, this is terrible, or I feel worse, or something's happening, then I would say, okay, you meet with the therapist to find out what's happening.
So if they're starting being going for years and getting bored, so it could just be not the right fit anymore.
Well, sometimes that can happen if you've been seeing somebody for many, many years and developmentally you've shifted to another stage where perhaps a better connection might happen with a different person. Sometimes that happens and sometimes that's valid. It's not because the therapist is bad, it's just that the nature of the relationship needs to shift along with the child. Hi.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned earlier that children who are suffering from anxiety or depression, often it can exacerbate other disorders or maybe get diagnosed as something else like ADHD or ODD. I guess how do you tell where the line is drawn and what's causing what, and whether you're dealing with anxiety and depression or something else because they look very similar?
Well, it can be a little tricky sometimes because they can co-occur. For example, in younger kids, it's really harder to differentiate anxiety and depression because they tend to have a lot of very similar symptoms. What I would say is it's always important to keep in mind if you see a primarily externalizing disorder like ADHD or ODD to also consider and have an evaluation for possible symptoms of anxiety or depression. But the best way to go about this is to get a really good psychodiagnostic evaluation, which means that the clinician will get information from you, from teachers, from other providers. We'll do observation, we'll do an interview with the child, and by doing that, trying to get to the cluster of symptoms that's most prevalent at the moment. Yes?
Just as a follow-up to that, would that be part of a basic neuropsych eval?
No, so a neuropsych is different from a psychodiagnostic. A neuropsych eval focuses on the neurological processes that are impacting the child or how he or she learns. So you would learn about things like memory skills, attention span, about processing speed, and those things are really helpful for the academic piece. Where it overlaps is that sometimes some of those processes are impacted by anxiety or depression. But a neuropsych evaluation does not do diagnosis. It does not do a mental health diagnosis. It gives you like a learning disability diagnosis or learning related issues, but it doesn't give you the mental health diagnosis. Make sense?
Yeah, but that would be through, you have to go through a psychologist for that?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Or a mental health clinician, a social worker, a licensed mental health clinician, a psychiatrist. Yes.
So can you do both of these evaluations?
You can do both. You can do both. And sometimes if you feel like you're not sure what's happening or how one is impacting the other, I always think it's really helpful to have a baseline of functioning for your child, because then you can see how things might be changing, and you can also understand his or her learning profile. And that can help in maximizing opportunities for success, which will impact mood. Yes.
This is a school. How would you support a group of students in the school who all tend to have an emotional based disorder? Would you recommend a classroom? Would you recommend one-on-one therapy? Because sometimes they have emotionally based classrooms, but some districts don't have that. So what have you seen work best?
That's a really tough question to answer, not knowing the group of kids. I think there can be different variations. One-on-one therapy, I think, can be really helpful, but especially for kids and adolescents, they need a broader spectrum of support. So, having the classroom teacher understand certain strategies to implement in the classroom, for example, can be helpful. Perhaps groups. Kids who struggle with anxiety and depression do well in groups because they realize they're not the only ones who are going through those struggles. But it depends the level of severity of the symptoms and what other things might be going on. So, okay, so I want to be respectful of your time. I know that we're out of time. Thank you so much for being here and for your time.
Just a couple of comments in closing. We got a lot of great information tonight. Thank you, Dr. Reilly. This is being recorded by HCAM, so it'll be retransmitted on the local Hingham cable channel. For the question that came up on friendship, a great one, and it was, we had Katie Schmitz from Skills for Living in Norwell come a few months ago, and she was taped by HCAM, and I believe her presentation is available on the SEPAC website. Might be a resource. We also run a 50-50 raffle, as it's a good way for us to raise funding, put events like this on. Many won't be winners, so for those the person who wins, we want to give you a chance to win. So it is 828-9967. So on behalf of HEF and Hingham SEPAC, we appreciate you coming tonight, and thank you, Dr. Reilly.
Thank you.